Good evening, everyone. James Hancock here. If you're watching this, I imagine that, like me, you decided to skip the Oscars in order to watch the Season 3 finale of True Detective, an episode called Now Am Found. The line comes from the tune Amazing Grace and has a direct link to some of Hayes' experiences in the latter part of this episode, which I'll be getting to in a minute. But to start, I just want to say that I'm experiencing a strange emotion right now in that this episode was so much about emotional closure, both for the characters and the audience, an unusual change of pace for a show that ordinarily is so much about terrifying mysteries with a hint of the supernatural. This episode threw us a few curveballs, in particular toward the end of the episode, but I have to say that overall I'm feeling very satisfied. While the plot of this show might be the main source of discussion online, this season for me has always been about the heart and soul of these characters, and while it wasn't technically the last scene, the image of Hayes and Roland hanging out on the porch with Hayes' family just made me feel good. The fact that they're going to be roommates a few nights a week just made me grin from ear to ear, and after all the violence and confusion and paranoia they've experienced throughout the season, seeing their friendship restored just filled me with a profound sense of well-being. Apart from wrapping up the central storyline, this episode had a variety of great scenes packed with so much emotion. Watching Roland go on the absolute warpath in a bar full of roughnecks was absolutely incredible. It was a pretty brutal fight scene with a lot of damage on both sides, but the best part was seeing him in the parking lot afterwards, drunk off his ass, covered in bruises and lacerations, befriending a stray dog, and then just weeping uncontrollably. It about broke my heart. The real showstopper emotionally was when Hayes lost his job in 1980 over Amelia's article, and he gets mean drunk. Before describing her to her face as a pretty bird shitting on people's heads, he tells her, "I was doing good without no head shitting birds in here." That's a line I might have to hang on to in the future. But getting down to the nitty-gritty in terms of the plot, going into this episode, the biggest lingering questions were, what were Julie's whereabouts in 2015? Who murdered her brother Will? What happened between Hayes and Hoyt when they drove off in 1990? And what caused the rift between Hayes and his daughter Rebecca? As it turns out, there wasn't that much of a rift between Hayes and his daughter Rebecca, but this episode answered all these questions to my satisfaction. But I must admit that I was a little let down by the confrontation between Hayes and Hoyt. I'm a massive Michael Rooker fan, and I was just hoping to see his character play a much more important role or a juicier part moving forward. Rooker definitely gave the role his all, and I enjoyed seeing him do his good old boy routine, like sipping from a hip flask of hooch while BSing about his days in the Army with Hayes. Compared to Junius Watts and Harris James, Hoyt actually knew comparatively little about what was going on in his own backyard most of the time. Due to a GPS tracker, he knows precisely where to find Harris, and eventually Hayes agrees to drop the case. What I really was hoping for was a deeper connection to the underground pedophile ring exposed in Season 1, but perhaps that might have been too predictable. As it turns out, the story of Will and Julie is pretty much a standalone story. The really meaty scenes this episode take place in 2015. Old man Hayes and Roland drive out to the Hoyt estate, which is largely abandoned now, and check out the pink room, as well as Julie's drawing of Junius Watts and Isabel on the wall. Roland calls in a favor at the DMV to get Junius Watts' address, and what follows is arguably the most interesting sequence cinematically all season. As Hayes and Roland are driving out to Watts' place, the story cuts back and forth between all the three eras in which we've seen these two characters have so many different experiences. At this point, for 35 years, this mystery has dominated the direction of their lives, and I just love how this show employed such a cool, simple editorial trick to make the drive visually much more interesting. This kind of creative flourishes are what have always set True Detective apart from other shows of a similar nature. Given Hayes and Roland's history of beating the hell out of people when they're interrogating them, I was worried about how nasty the scene might get. When they confront Watts, they arrive with their guns drawn. As it turns out, however, Watts is tortured by a guilty conscience and is willing to spill his guts. He tells him everything about how Hoyt's daughter Isabel was shattered by the loss of her daughter Mary and needed a lot of lithium just to function. Then at a company gathering, she took an interest in Julie, and Watts soon started arranging playdates. Lucy was well paid, and Will was always there to look after Julie, but when Isabel stopped taking her medication, she became increasingly confused, and she ended up killing Will by accident when she pushed him. Watts told Julie at the time that eventually Will would wake up, and they left him as we saw him in the cave. For years, Isabel used her lithium to keep Julie drugged in the pink room, and according to Watts, Julie was happy overall for many years, until finally she grew up and Watts agreed to help her escape. Julie went missing, Isabel killed herself, and then Watts spent years looking for Julie, only to learn in 1997 that she had died in 1995 from an HIV-related illness while working at a convent. Due to being racked with guilt, Watts desperately wants to either be killed or arrested, but Roland simply gives his gun rack a good long hard look and tells Watts to take care of his own guilty conscience. And at this point, I thought the show was pretty much done until Hayes and Roland decided to visit the convent and Julie's grave, and they bump into a fellow named Tom and his daughter Lucy. I immediately lost the sense of closure just from the name Lucy alone, but I particularly lost the sense of closure as Hayes started rereading Amelia's book, in particular the passages about a boy named Tom who had been in love with Julie as kids. The memory of Amelia comes to Hayes and suggests to him that stories truly never really have an end, and what if Tom had met Julie working at the convent, and that the story of her death was simply one they cooked up to give Julie a second lease on life. At any rate, he pursues the lead, he finds Julie and her daughter Lucy, and then we have one of these sad, senile moments where Hayes loses track of why he's there. We, the audience, might have a sense of closure with the story getting wrapped up, but my heart went out to this poor guy whose whole life has been devoted, first in the army to being the best tracker imaginable, and then being the best detective that he could be. But once his son comes to pick him up, once again, I thought of the title of the episode and the tune Amazing Grace, and everything kind of clicked into place for me. As far as final fates are concerned, spending time with his kids and grandkids and getting drunk with Roland won't be too bad for Hayes. What I really loved was the final shot where we see Hayes as a young man in the jungles of Vietnam. It perfectly summed up how he's basically been on the hunt his entire life, but perhaps now he's finally earned himself something resembling some peace and quiet. In any case, between the third season of True Detective and Sharp Objects last summer, the last 12 months have proven HBO to be probably the best source of crime stories on television. I hope they'll continue to develop and nurture these kinds of tales. I don't really give a damn about police procedurals, but legitimate mysteries dripping with style and atmosphere are absolutely my cup of tea. Now that the show's over, I'm not quite sure what to do with my Sunday evenings, although I am excited to see Season 2 of American Gods and Stars, which starts 2 weeks from tonight. And of course, we're going to blink and it'll suddenly be April 14th, which is the return of Game of Thrones. In any event, if you've been following my videos this season, I've thoroughly enjoyed the ride with all of you. A mystery isn't nearly as much fun to watch if you don't get to share theories around the water cooler after a particularly juicy ep. I think this show is back in an incredibly strong place, and I imagine that whenever HBO and Nick Pizzolatto decide to return with Season 4, the show will be met with thunderous anticipation. So I hope everyone out there had as much fun with Season 3 as I did. If you've been watching my videos, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the support. You can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax, and there's a link in the description below. But thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.